a particular because I minimized my window and now I really can't see anybody
Oh, you're
anymore.
you're fine. You're fine.
I'm fine. Okay.
Yes. Good morning, colleagues, and welcome to episode 10. Yes, it is episode 10 of Transforming Guyana. I'm Terrence Blackman, Associate Professor of Mathematics at Medgar Evers College in the City University of New York and the founder of the Guyana Business Journal. And I'm joined by my co host, Dr. David Lewis of the Caribbean Policy Consortium and Manchester Trade. Uh, as usual, it's always good to be reminded of the goal of this series, Transforming Guyana. So we aim together to bring together experts and prominent voices and diverse voices from Guyana and the diaspora to discuss aspects of Guyana's oil and gas development and to take a nuanced look at the opportunities and potential pitfalls ahead. We also want to explore strategies to maximize the positive impacts the oil revenue can have on Guyana's people and future while mitigating the risks that other countries have faced in this kind of transition. And since we're coming to you from the diaspora and we're joined by many folks in the diaspora, we also want to identify some of the promising roles that the diaspora can play in this transition. Today, we have what we have euphemistically called our white paper webinars, and because we've asked Dr. Ulrich Trots, sort of the dean of Guyanese science community, to take a look at the intersection of development, energy development, and and environmental stewardship. And what he's produced for us is a white paper, which we've called, Unlocking Guyana's Oil and Gas Potential, Balancing Energy Development and Environmental Stewardship. And today we're going to have some discussion of this white paper by Dr. Trots, and we'll be joined in that discussion by Dr. Thomas Singh of the University of Guyana's Green Institute and Dr. Anthony Bryan from the University of West Indies and also the Caribbean Policy Consortium. Let me take a moment to ask my colleague David to say a few introductory words before I return to introduce Dr. Trots and to listen to his presentation. David, take it from here.
Good morning, Terrence, Tony Bryan, Thomas Singh in Guyana. Welcome to our audience in Guyana, in the diaspora, internationally and in regionally. It actually is episode 10, so we're almost there with year one. And as Terrence mentioned, we've sought in these programs to both engage discussions with the diaspora, but also with, of course, colleagues in Guyana on some of the pressing issues in Guyana with regards to the economic, social, political, cultural transformations that have been taking place in the country as a result of the energy growth, the new energy economy, and a variety of the initiatives taking place both at the public policy and the private sector level. We do not suppose that we are replacing any discussions at the government public policy level or the private sector engagement, but really just adding on and providing a space and a medium for open discussion, not just of experts, but lay people with regards to many of these issues. I will only add, because this is episode 10, we will have two more for year one, that both the GBJ and the CPC are already in discussions to continue with year two. And I would like to offer those in the audience. We actually now roam around close to 100 people for each webinar, and actually social media access and links in the tens of thousands, to please provide us feedback on topics that you think we should be focusing on, speakers, participants that you think we should be inviting from Guyana and from the diaspora, and we will certainly take those into account. There's some key topics that we will always go back to, which are being developed more and more in Guyana, things like gas to power, new developments in the oil and gas development. But there's a variety of areas which we haven't touched on, and we certainly would like to focus on more. So please take that as an open invitation through this electronic medium to share with us some of your interests, some of your feedback, and we will certainly work together to see that that can be developed. So with that, Terence, I'd leave for you to do
on the side of the wall goes away. And as I was preparing for this program, I found this really wonderful bit about seawall vulnerability, which will make us smile. And then I will do a short introduction of Dr. Trots, and then we will lead into his presentation. So here goes. Something from Guyana, which keeps me up and should keep you up at night. And in part, this is why this program is structured in the way that it is. So, yes, that is indeed the water jumping over the wall. And you know, we this is an existential threat for Guyana, and we're hoping that Dr. Trots can provide us with some thoughts in this regard. Let me take a moment to introduce, because I think often we've not fully apprised ourselves of the genuine talents that exist within us. So give me a moment to say a few words of introduction of Dr. Trots, our speaker today. A scientist by training, Dr. Trots is the past science advisor for the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center in Belize. Dr. Trots earned his undergraduate degree at Edinburgh University. He obtained a Bachelor's of Science degree in chemistry and his doctorate in organic chemistry, one of the hardest subjects for undergraduates and for graduate students at the University of Toronto in Canada. His career experiences and achievements have been wide and varied. He's worked as the Director of Science and Technology Division at the Commonwealth Secretariat. He, as the Secretary to the Commonwealth Science Council and Science Advisor to the Commonwealth Secretary General. He's been the Dean. He's been the Secretary of the National Science Research Council for Guyana. He's the Dean of the Faculty of Sciences at the University of Guyana. He served as the Director of the Institute of Applied Sciences and Technology in Guyana, and many, many, many others. But what I think most important, Dr. Trots served as a member of a group of scientists awarded Nobel Prize in 2008 as a review editor for Chapter 16 on small island developing states in the fourth assessment report on the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change, the IPCC. And so it's a great pleasure to welcome Dr. Trots to the program, and the floor is yours. Dr. Trots, you're muted. You're muted, Dr. Trots. I can't seem to hear me. Let me do the following. You're muted, Dr. Trots.
Yes, sorry.
Yes,
I've been having some difficulties with connection.
I've noted that.
Yeah.
So I've tried to introduce you as best as I can, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and I welcome this opportunity to participate in this particular discussion. I come to you basically through the lens of my experience over the last 2 decades in the region, dealing with issues related to the region's vulnerability to climate change. And so I want us to look at Guyana pre-2015. when our preoccupation and
So it seems as if we're having a bit of internet trouble in this moment. Maybe what I might do is to just switch the order of things, and perhaps Professor Brian, if you might be so I,
you miss.
yes, we just missed a small part of your. It froze for a moment.
Okay. Yeah, the point is that we have been looking at the issues of climate change, and this has culminated through our participation in the global discussions on climate change to the Paris Agreement, which in 2015 basically agreed that we should try to limit global warming to 1.5, and that 1.5 was at the instance of initiatives here in the Caribbean, where we introduced the 1.5 concept into the global discussions. So we have a Paris Agreement, and what has transpired over the time since the agreement is that we've come to realize that to achieve its targets, we need by 2030 to cut global emissions to by 50% of what it is at this point in time. And more significantly for this discussion, that we should achieve a net zero status by 2050. And we should have phased out the use of fossil fuels at that time. And I say this requirement, global requirement to satisfy the Paris Agreement has some significance to what we are discussing. That is fossil fuels phasing out. One of the issues we need to keep in mind is that over the years, we've been reporting to the convention, we've been talking about plans, what we plan to do in terms of building climate resilience, what we plan to do in terms of dealing with greenhouse gas emissions. Though for us as developing countries and in the Caribbean, the latter, cutting back on emissions, was secondary to what we regarded was more important, that we needed to build resilience to the impacts of climate change. As a result, we sent in plans, and most recently, and keeping with the requests for the Paris Agreement, we sent in what is known as nationally determined contributions, which tells about how we're going to achieve net zero status, the plans, which talks about how we're going to build climate resilience at the same time. But these are basically expressions of intent. We can't and we haven't been able to implement simply because of the difficulty in getting climate finance. In 2009 in Cancun, there's a global agreement to establish a green climate fund, capitalize it at the level of 100 billion US per year. Up to now, 2023, that has not been realized. Climate finance has been a stumbling block, a major stumbling block in the global discussions. And very recently, it was more or less estimated that 100 billion is a drop in the ocean. What we really need to significantly address
So we're at once again, just a small frozen point.
well, we'll have to
No, but we were. I'm listening carefully. 100 billion is a drop in the ocean, and what we need to do is to address. So, yes.
Now let's fast forward.
Yeah, we genuinely seem to be having a little challenge with the strength of the connection.
Guyana discovered oil and gas, and overnight, Guyana was identified as one major producer of oil and gas. In 2015,
Yeah. So I'm not sure if it the connection becomes stronger a bit later, but I'm tempted to
deposits,
okay.
new deposits of oil and gas. So we are now a major oil and gas producer. Hence the question, we are supposed to be, in the trenches calling for phasing out fossil fuels, etc. And now we find ourselves as a major producer of oil and gas. How do we reconcile this? This what is a contradiction in terms of our interests and our actions. Now, let us look what has happened with the development since 2015.
We do seem to be having a genuine challenge in terms of sort of making this work. What I'm going to do is, with your permission, Dr. Trots, I'm going to pivot to Professor Brian so with your permission, Dr. Trots, let me do this. Let me pivot to Professor Brian, pull him into the discussion, and then to Professor Singh, and then we'll just reiterate your presentation broadly as part of the sort of conversation that we might have between the three of you. So let me do that. So Professor Brian, you're muted. So if you can take a moment just to kind of talk through some of what emerges in the white paper from this regional perspective, i.e. the questions of resilience, adaptability in a kind of regional context.
Yes, Ulrich, I'm sorry for this interruption in the internet. And I think, if I might, Terence, the conclusions and the recommendations in the paper are excellent, right? This is a fantastic piece of research by Dr. Trots. And he has indicated in so many ways what Guyana would have to do when we're talking about climate risk assessments. He's talked about the implementation for sea defense, for drainage and irrigation, for agriculture and healthcare, energy security, the feasibility of utilizing the oil and gas resources to satisfy the food and energy security needs of CARICOM countries as we transition to zero status. He's talked about strengthen institutional capacity to monitor and regulate the oil and gas industry. And I think he has pointed out that the focus that needs to be done on providing the EPA in Guyana, with the capacity to provide Guyana with oversight to ensure that the gas and oil operations do not in any way compromise the integrity of fragile ecosystems to the extent that it disrupts livelihoods and negatively impacts the lives and well-being of the citizens of Guyana. As I say, this is a very interesting paper in the sense that it does intertwine, the idea that here is a country with fantastic natural resources, certainly in oil and gas now, and how do you reconcile that with its, often stated position of trying to make sure that climate change does not impact negatively. What I would add to just get the argument going, if Ulrich is able to get back on, is that the discovery of abundant oil resources has really magnetized foreign direct investment into Guyana since 2015. But there's another side to it, in the sense that multilateral organizations such as the World Bank, they have criticized Guyana for the way it has overseen offshore oil projects. And I think this is one of the points that Ulrich is making, that there needs to be a great deal more oversight in managing oil projects and in managing the resources that come from them. Environmentalists have also voiced concerns about Guyana joining the oil and gas industry while the world transitions away from fossil fuels. But I think this has been answered by Guyana's president, where he says it aims to use the oil windfall to diversify the economy, improve access to social services, and promote investment in non-oil sectors, including agriculture, tourism, and manufacturing. And I think that is the position that the oil producers in the region, namely Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana, and Suriname, have adopted. I tried to summarize it in an article in the roundtable some time ago by saying, drill, baby, drill. Continue to drill. Okay? You deploy the resources into the areas that you would like to see built up. What I think we find is that there is a need, and I think Ulrich points it out very strongly, need for transparency around oil revenues, government spending, the wealth fund. These are things that we have to pay attention to.
Yeah.
And I would go even further and say that Guyana is in a splendid position to really dictate a little bit about what the international global climate agenda should be. All right? It has the resources, it has the influence, it has the attention of the world. So this is a historic opportunity to deliver both on climate mitigation and development goals. As you know, we do a lot of this in Africa and elsewhere by leapfrogging to new technologies.
Yeah.
That's your field, I know. New technologies for low-cost renewable power and shifting energy demand. And you make progress at the pace necessary to deliver on global climate and development goals. It requires investment, and I think developing countries such as ours, and certainly with Guyana, should ask developed countries for measures to rebuild trust and confidence in international cooperation. I think, my bottom line is that Guyana is in a position to do this now. I don't know whether they've thought ahead in that way. Maybe Ulrich can tell us. The only concern I have, which I didn't find the paper told me enough about, and maybe Ulrich can expound, is that our common law systems in Guyana, in Trinidad, and the English-speaking Caribbean generally, they haven't ever been prepared to deal with environment and to deal with, as it were, managing. So there's a whole legal framework that has to be changed, adopted, built upon to simply be sure that the legislation that we say we would like to have, in fact, can be done under the existing law systems. That's about all I would want to say at the moment. And I look
Thank
forward
you.
to coming back in. Thank you very much.
Yes. So I want to pull Professor Thomas Singh in, and let me see. Thomas, can you start your video? And Thomas wanted to speak some on questions related to the carbon credits, but it also seems that Thomas is having. Are you there, Thomas? Yeah.
Actually, Terence, I am.
Okay.
Good afternoon, good day.
Good
I was
afternoon.
wondering if I can use some slides. It's not at all necessary.
Yes, you certainly can.
So
would
I
have been.
just have to upload them, which is what I was
So
just about
on
to
the
do.
on the on the on the on the bottom button there, you
Yes, I
can
see it.
yeah, and you can just
Very well then.
yes.
But do go ahead. I hope to get this done in a couple of seconds.
Okay, so perhaps while you aim to do that, I think you Professor Brian, you raised a very important point, and I wanted to actually walk through in some way. So maybe while Thomas tries to
It
upload
should
the
be up there.
slides, yeah, I see them. I'm going to add them to the stream, and so you can go ahead and offer your comments. And I'll
Thank
just
you.
take.
Thank you, Terence. Just one little bit of one query. Would you be moving slides for me, or
I
how it
certainly
works?
can't. I think
No,
you
no,
have
no.
the
I think I
control.
can do so. I
Okay,
can do so.
you can do
Very
so.
well.
Yes, yes.
Yes. So it is an absolute pleasure to be here, an honor, and I'd like to thank Dr. Blackman and Dr. Lewis for this opportunity. What makes it special is an excellent paper by Dr. Trots, and I would have it would have been a special thing for him to have been in the room while I'm doing this. That's to say, these comments in his paper. I shall begin by making reference, if you don't mind, to a comment that Ulrich made. That's to say that Reister, that consulting firm, notes that the government of Ghana receives 59% of the total value of the Stabroek asset. That is true because Reister does not consider this thing called cost recovery. That's to say, it considers the investment and it considers operating costs. But if it did, as you can see in the slide, this is a rough calculation here. Reister uses present values, so the numbers are a bit different. Whereas they say 59%, I think I have at the bottom there, I have 53% or so. But now, if you were to look at the bits in red, they're in dollars there. If the price of a barrel of oil is $78, then the government of Guyana gets $11.12, and the contractor gets, about $67. The point is that if there is cost recovery, and I should add, if there are additional investments that require additional outlays of costs, then we'd be a little bit it'll be a bit misleading to focus on the government take given at the bottom there on the basis of net cash flow. So having said that, and it's not at all a criticism of what Ulrich has done, it's just that he quoted that and I thought I should mention that. Let me just get into the few comments that I have. Ulrich's paper addressed particularly this dilemma, this deep paradox here. How can Guyana maintain its claim to be contributing to climate stabilization because of its forests when it's now a significant producer of and exporter of oil? Ulrich noted the official response. So it is that because of our forest's contribution to climate mitigation, because Guyana's oil is for export and combustion elsewhere, Guyana has every reason to extract as much oil as possible, as quickly as possible, without any obligations regarding climate change. Furthermore, Ulrich notes this, Dr. Trots, the world will continue to need and to use fossil fuels. Guyana's good oil is better than somebody else's bad oil. Guyana's oil is good because it's light, it's sweet crude, and the carbon intensity of its extraction is low. Furthermore, Guyana has launched its LCDS, which will further reduce the country's carbon footprint. So, for all of those reasons, we should just simply keep on producing oil. And I should say at the outset that I have no difficulty with this position. I do believe, however, that there's stuff going on behind the scenes that we as intelligent people ought to be aware of. First of all, if Guyana claims that it owns the carbon sequestered in its forest, it must also claim ownership of the carbon sequestered in its crude oil. That's in the ground, that's even in each barrel of oil. But once Guyana's extracted oil is combusted, then now it's Guyana's petrocarbon would be released, admittedly elsewhere. Does it matter where the petrocarbon is actually released? From a climate change perspective, it doesn't. And as far as, however, these nationally determined contributions go, it does matter, and we in Guyana can claim it's not our business. I take the view, while agreeing that we should extract and monetize the resource, I take the view that Guyana does have an obligation, it does have an opportunity, which is the last point I'll touch on today, to ensure that the full cost of its petrocarbon is borne by those responsible for its release. To paraphrase Dr. Trots, by exporting its petrocarbon, Guyana is in a contradictory position as both a current victim of climate change and an actor exacerbating the problem for itself and for everybody else. So I think we have an obligation that we need to think about. Secondly, as we consider this official response, if ownership of forests and petrocarbon by Guyana results in a net carbon liability in some sort of notional carbon balance sheet that we might have as a country, would the LCDS 2030 investments, so we are on the liability side, shall we say, because of our fossil fuels, would those LCDS investments reduce our carbon footprint by enough to balance this notional carbon balance sheet for ourselves and for the world for that matter? Guyana's forests sequester about 90, and I hope I get these numbers right. Guyana's numbers sequester about 19.5 gigatons of CO2, while our 11 billion barrels of crude oil sequester 4.8 gigatons of CO2. So, in point of fact, we might not even be a net liability. We might be on the positive side, if you will, having net assets as far as the sequestration of carbon goes. But while that might be the case, the 4.8 gigatons of CO2 in our 11 billion barrels of oil are coming at a wrong time, if you will. That is the problem. The 4.8 gigatons of petro CO2 is going to be released after the stock of CO2 has already placed us in a very precarious position. That 4.8 gigatons of CO2 can't be compared with the 19.5 gigatons of forest carbon, because the latter, A, won't be released as fast as the 4.8 petrocarbons, and because the damage done by the latter would be seriously life-threatening. My position is that the LCDS does not remove the ethical and practical dilemmas and contradictions But the energy investments in the LCDS create a further problem for us if they would trap us squarely in what Ulrich calls the energy bridge, precluding our own energy transition because we are locked into these bridge energy solutions. I'm saying that the LCDS 2030 does not provide a level of comfort that allows us to see our obligations are discharged. That's the official position. And I'm
Mhm.
not saying that. I'm sort of suggesting that that can't be the case. I turn now quickly to resilience. I know this was one of the issues you wanted us to talk about. And it turns out that resilience is an issue. Very quickly, the LCDS 2030 investments referred to by Ulrich as a sort of an attempt and a solution to address this dilemma. At least that's the official position as well. We're doing so through the LCDS. It addresses resilience by investments in health and education in particular, and some equity, addressing some equity issues, particularly to do with our indigenous people. But those solutions, by and large, ignore social inclusion, social capital formation, ignore enhancing the capacity of society to bounce back from shocks, external negative shocks. They enhance individual abilities, but we in Guyana have some serious problems to do with conflict. And I have a little thing at the bottom there to reinforce my point that it takes society to withstand and respond to external shocks. For example, the conflicts, there are many conflicts and disagreements about EIA's for oil projects, about the gas to shore pipeline, would have a major those conflicts and the fractures and fissures associated with this would have a major impact on our ability to deal with, say, an oil spill. So I feel that resilience has not been really adequately addressed by the LCDS. And finally, I won't get into the slide, Terence, but
No,
I
I think it's go ahead. Please.
okay.
Yes.
I was going to say that I mentioned earlier, Clock, that Guyana actually has an opportunity now, something referred to by Professor Bryan, to position itself as not just an oil producer in an apologetic sort of sense, but to say rather boldly that we might actually have a way of, we might actually be able to nudge, um, have a nudge, to provide a nudge for carbon pricing. Guyana has done two things that are relevant to carbon pricing. First of all, there's been this excess flaring emissions charge. It's now set at $45 per ton of CO2. And I myself was part of designing that. I played an important part in that. And secondly, we've got the sale of forest carbon on the voluntary carbon markets,
Yeah.
$20 per ton. That's the price there. Economists will immediately feel uncomfortable about making a useful contribution to um, introducing pricing in an emerging, developing market if we've got two prices to start with. And if we know anything about the price of carbon, there are many, many prices that range from very low, $5 per ton, and I've seen all the way through to $700 per ton. Under the Obama administration, the number that was being used was $40 per ton. The idea of carbon pricing is that um, there is this negative externality that market participants don't consider whenever there's pollution. The CO2 is not something that is being actively traded when we buy, um, we fill up at the pump. But there has been CO2 that's been produced, if you will. The thing is that CO2 becomes everybody else's business. And that is not good for markets. And for it actually constitutes what we call a market failure. And as we remember, Nicholas Stern referred to climate change as the world's largest market failure. It's precisely because of this phenomenon here. Thus, the discussion now is seriously about putting a price on carbon. Guyana can, by something that I'm calling an upstream carbon tax at the wellhead, which is to say, we can calculate that we know that the amount of carbon in every barrel of oil is about 0.433 tons of carbon in every barrel of oil. If we therefore set a price for carbon, let's say $45 per ton, then we can then apply that price to the carbon content of every barrel of oil. What that would do is it would assist us, not us in Guyana, but assist everyone to begin to internalize this cost of carbon. I should mention in conclusion that this is not idle talk. It's not it's really not idle talk because the European Union has introduced this so-called CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. The EU has its own emissions trading system. It is a well-known one, it's a highly developed one. But on top of that now, it's introducing this carbon adjustment mechanism that would ensure that when it imports from the rest of the world products that have carbon in them, that its argument is that it's leveling the playing field because its own domestic producers and consumers are paying, a carbon price, if you will, because of the ETS. By this adjustment, other countries that don't have such a carbon price will be forced to, at the border, to pay that price. And goods entering the EU then will reflect that price. What that will do, granted it's not on every good and every service, as yet, it's not certainly on every good, but it's providing a nudge to carbon pricing. And if Guyana does not do this, but we're exporting to the EU, we will meet a carbon price there. What will happen is that the EU collects the revenues. With this upstream carbon tax, Guyana gets the revenues, and we could use those revenues to address adaptation, to build resilience, and to address the problem that Ulrich talked about, that climate finance has not been coming our way, because we'd be able to then self-generate climate finance, I would argue, not just for Guyana, but if this is done for the Guyana-Suriname basin, then we might do it for the Caribbean, the wider Caribbean. So with those words,
Oh,
Colin,
well, thank you. I appreciated those contributions, and certainly, uh, this question that you raise of of the the carbon balance sheet, so to speak, and how one arrives at it, is in part the motivation for it's part of the motivation for the program, to sort of say, we have this carbon balance sheet, but how do we integrate these questions? I started with this little clip from the seawall. The water jumps over the wall, as it has here during Sandy, and something that I experienced is that when it happens, there are immediate needs. The society has to recover, and in this sense, I think that how do we prepare ourselves to recovery if we don't find ways to optimize the resources that, fortunately or unfortunately, are emerging from precisely the thing that is causing the problem. And so this is the conversation that I think we need to have, and we need to have it with some real clarity and some objectivity, and with sober minds. David, I want to give you a chance to come in, and then we'll try to see if we can get Ulrich back, and maybe we'll ask Ulrich to, given it looks like bandwidth issues, to maybe not use his video and just come with the voice and see what happens there. So you go first, David. You're muted, and then we'll try to pull Ulrich back into the discussion.
Wonderful, thank you, and I do hope we can get him back because this is an excellent paper. And for people who've asked, we will be posting the paper in a couple of days on the website, so everybody will have access to it. And we look forward to more feedback. I think the closing comments on Professor Singh really hit the nail on the head, and Dr. Trots has this front and center in his paper, which is the overall issue of revenue, usage, and management that Guyana now can benefit from with regards to oil and gas development. Two, work on mitigating the climate change and environmental hazards from fossil fuel exploitation. And I think that's one of the key aspects. And there's a variety of recommendations that Dr. Trots proposes. Professor Bryan mentioned those, but one of the questions I would have for him, if he could, in his comments when he gets back with us, is what are the top issues that he sees currently missing from both the government and the companies' agendas in terms of facilitating that mitigation effort on a more rapid basis? Or is this being done satisfactory right now? Because what I see coming out of Guyana and elsewhere is a lot of questioning of whether or not we are doing this. And his paper brings out a lot of information that, yes, with the low carbon development strategy, and despite some issues with it, Guyana is on that road. Professor Singh and Professor Bryan have mentioned that. But the question really is Guyana doing enough, both at the government and private sector level? Can more be done? And my comment on that is really the issue where the paper is really also excellent on, which is the challenge of institutional and human capacity to manage all this. In many of our Transforming Guyana webinars, we have discussed the skills challenge in Guyana to develop a modern economy, not just in the energy sector, but the whole economy, a grosso modo, because of the small size of the labor pool in Guyana, but the need also to revolutionize, if you will, exponentially the skills to address this massive growth. I mean, this is no joke when you say an economy is growing at 56% growth every year. I mean, people, the Chinese were happy with 5 to 7 every year. Well, this is a major challenge in terms of who are the bodies. These aren't going to be robots. This is not going to be artificial intelligence. You need people with skills to manage all these areas. And we've all been seeing the challenges that this brings to the table. So again, with this resource boon that Guyana has because of oil and gas, the question then, okay, how can Guyana use these rapidly and exponentially to develop the local, but also the foreign skills capability to handle this at the level of world-class economy that the energy sector is imposing, if you will, quote unquote, on Guyana, because it is a world-class best practice benchmark that's taken place. So again, that's something to be worked on. It puts us into that touchy subject of labor policy, importing labor, and so on. We've had discussions in our webinars on the models from other countries in the world, small economies where there's a ratio of 10 to 1 of foreign workers to local workers. But there is a pressing need that if we're going to get this moving, the skills base needs to be advanced. And I think the paper does a great contribution in terms of emphasizing the need for that institutional and human capacity. Emphasis is made, and it's been discussed, on the role of the EPA and some of the government agencies. But I would say that we also need to go beyond that. Private sector capabilities and civil society capabilities, because where we have seen examples of successfully managing the oil and gas resource growth, we also see the successful development of institutionality at the government, at the private sector, and at the civil society level. So that would be my second question to to Dr. Trots, which is what can be done more and better to develop that institutional capability he has mentioned and which we all know is so great. So let me just stop there, Terence. Thank you all again. This is an excellent session. And for the audience, you will be seeing the paper soon on the websites, and you'll be able to dig deep into it and into the commentary.
Thank you, David. Dr. Trots, are you able to come in? If you
Yes, I am.
Yeah, so maybe if you don't turn the video on, but just go with the voice. So can you respond to some of the
Yes, sure. Uh, Let me say that the the basic point I wanted to make was that dealing with this issue of being an oil and gas producer while at the same time being vulnerable to climate change is the fact that we need to look at how the resources derived from oil and gas are utilized for the benefit of the Guyanese people. If you look at the implementation of the LCDS, there's been a lot of activity on the zero carbon sort of aspiration with the gas to shore project, the Amila Falls, the renewable energy systems for the interior, etc. We've been addressing the mitigation aspect of the LCDS. And it's very interesting that, a lot of this conversation has been more or less focused on the mitigation aspect of the LCDS, whereas over the years, in the international community, we have been trumpeting adaptation. Our position was that we are in a world that is committed to climate change. And we, as small developing countries whose carbon footprint in terms of the global greenhouse gas emissions budget is very minimal, we need to build climate resilience. And this is one of the concerns I have at the moment with the LCDS rollout, is that enough priority isn't being given to climate resilience as it should be. We are putting onshore facilities. We see big hotels going up, onshore facilities to support the industry, the oil and gas industry, but being put on a vulnerable coast that is 6 feet below sea level. Drainage and irrigation and sea defense are two critical factors that should be at the top of the agenda. And resources derived from oil and gas, I think, should be prioritized in terms of investing in a safer coast. You wake up in a couple of days and everything could be underwater. We need basically to do that. And a word to the people, the private sector, the environmental and social impact assessments are a requirement. It's not only a government requirement. It behoves investors and private sectors to actually do it. There's a paradigm. ESIAs, formerly we looked at the impact of our development on environment. Climate change has caused a shift in the paradigm where building in vulnerable areas, it should be an interest to the developer. What would be the impact of future climate on my investment? So it's imperative, and I am concerned about waiving of ESIAs to major development projects on a fragile coast. Let me read something particularly in response to my colleague, Dr. Singh's comment on the LCDS. This is from the LCDS revised version. Guyana will strategically and responsibly, as the sector develops, supporting global energy security while diversifying and decarbonizing Guyana's domestic economy and investing in development priorities for all Guyanese, including health, education, and low carbon opportunities. At the same time, and this is interesting, the government will advocate internationally for a strong global carbon price and the removal of subsidies on fossil fuel to incentivize the lowest carbon, most cost-effective oil and gas in the global marketplace in line with the goals of the Paris Agreement, under which there will be demand for decades to come. In parallel, Guyana will advance a no flaring policy and mandate the use of best technology in oil and gas sector to limit its environmental impact. So we would expect that the industry itself would basically utilize the best technology, and the fact that they're using FPSOs offshore is an indication of that new technology. That's one of the reasons why the carbon footprint of our production is so low. Now, the point is that if we could put on the market oil that basically has a less carbon footprint and is more economic, then we are making some contribution to the global greenhouse gas budget management. In this sense, if we compare the fuel coming from Venezuela in terms of its production and in terms of its basically export, etc., the carbon footprint from that stream is much higher than anything that we are producing. And this is one of the reasons why I am strongly suggesting that Guyana, Suriname, Trinidad, and Tobago look at internalizing the whole question of energy security. And we have a mandate from our heads to look at energy security, in that the whole supply chain for the Caribbean as they transition to net zero is a local supply, local in the sense that it's from the CARICOM region. This requires, for instance, I was a bit disappointed when heads decided that they will try to resuscitate the Petro-Carib agreement. I don't understand why they wouldn't internalize that need and look at possibly Petro-CARICOM agreement, whereby the resources from Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana, Suriname are basically utilized to satisfy, in the first instance, the Caribbean's need for energy as they transition to no carbon, no carbon status. The other thing about that is that we're talking about food security. What about looking at the Point Lisas facility and its resuscitation, mainly for us to provide the region and particularly Guyana, Suriname, Belize, with the fertilizers needed to underwrite that food security. Let's internalize the whole supply chain, which also has the advantage of shorter transshipment distances to move fuel to where it's being utilized. Guyana is going ahead apparently with refinery, and again, why as a Caribbean, don't we look at what refinery capacity we have in the region, particularly in Trinidad and Tobago, and see whether it's not better resuscitate that and use it basically as part of this regional thrust. The other thing is that building climate resilience adaptation usually ends up, the output is something that can be regarded as a public good. Dealing with our drainage and sea defense is a public good. And so investment, getting private sector investment, etc., is challenging. And usually it falls on governments to take that initiative. On the other hand, changing from the present architecture of the regional energy sector, from one that is fossil fuel based to renewable and employing, of course, energy efficient measures, investments in that are easier to come by. Why? Because the outcome, when we switch from fossil fuel-based energy to renewables, is significant savings which can be utilized to repay the debt that we incur. I'm suggesting that we internalize that too. Why not establish a regional fund that would, of course, I volunteered some contributions from Guyana's Natural Resources Fund, and from governments and from credit unions, from our indigenous banks, managed by the CDB. We have to go cap in hand to the international donors and investors who would be very willing to invest in the energy transformation activities in the region, because the internal rate of return on those types of investments are excellent. So it's a good investment landscape. Let the IDB basically manage that fund and also use it as a kind of counterpart funds to attract foreign funds into it. But then it will be under our conditions and not those dictated by external investors. So there, I think the question is how we can use those resources. And I would hope, that we can actually do calculation, basically looking at if we internalize this whole question of oil, of fossil fuel transition, and look at food security and energy security, and do calculation about the carbon footprint of if we adopt an internal approach, or if we adopt the usual, approach, looking at overseas for supplies, etc. What would be the difference? My guess is that it will be a significant difference. One, there is a question that, apart from everything else, Guyana, there is, of course, a lot of, I would say, we need to, let's take the LCDS. One of the recommendations I've made is that we need to promote a sense of ownership with the Guyanese population for the actions in the LCDS. And this will require a nationwide public and education outreach effort to inform communities throughout the country of the actions for the implementation, status of the implementation, and plans for future implementation, and encourage a culture of full disclosure to enhance trust and benefit from informed feedback from the public. We should aim to make public consultations events that the public can contribute to meaningfully. and over time gain confidence and provide their support for the successful rolling out of the key elements of the LCDS. We need to bring people along. And certainly the LCDS calls for inclusivity, national consultation with relevant communities, adherence to the legal provisions for oil and gas regulation and operation, transparency, access to information, and adherence to the requirement for free and prior and informed consent, especially as it applies to interfacing with our indigenous communities. As far as the investors, Exxon and company are concerned, I would expect that in the oil and gas industry, there are a whole set of innovations to basically minimize environmental impacts. And I would hope that they would adopt the best possible technology as they move forward so that we benefit from that. Also, I think that they could do much more in terms of helping to build the capacity at the University of Guyana in Nari, the Agricultural Research Center, Iwakrama for the work that they have to do in ecosystem services, on the Bina Institute, and other institutions, and our technical and vocational institutions, to start to build local capacity, basically carry out some of the services that are essential for the running of the industry. And certainly, the Environmental and Protection Agency, it is critical that Guyana has the capacity to provide proper oversight for the implementation of this whole new industry throughout the country. This is important. So on the side of the industry, I think too that looking at global best practice, the industry itself, one would hope, will not take advantage of lax oversight in Guyana and inadequate legislative infrastructure to not employ best practice as they move forward. I would like to see also we have an LCDS for implementation. I would suggest to the company, apart from everything else, that they look at how they could support some of the actions that are required to ensure that Guyana is more climate resilient. That it's, for instance, its agricultural sector is more protected from future climate, that people are living in a much more secure environment. In other words, I think there is room there for them to give back to an area where, as I say, investments don't come easily. It has to be basically undertaken by government. And in that sense, this is why I feel that some of the NRF money, some of the money derived from our forest conservation as a priority should be invested in making our people secure and safe in a very vulnerable environment. This was not intended to be my presentation, but I think, it gives the essence of some of what I wanted to get over.
Thank you very much. I think it sort of, weird worked better having you sort of come at the end. But I wanted to go back to this question that Thomas raised, and I think this is LCDS, and I think you were just addressing this LCDS is a kind of it's the sort of bridge to the zero carbon future, and I think in a sense this is the part where you and Thomas are having some difficulty. So I went to come back to Thomas and ask, does the bridge seem to work better now after Dr. Trots's presentation, or do you still think that aspects of the bridge precludes in some substantive sense the movement to the zero carbon future?
Well, let's speak about things. Thank you, Terence. And by the way, Dr. Trots's presentation was, really excellent. He said things far better than I would have. I myself was able to say, even when I was trying to say those things. So financially now, we heard that Guyana will be paying 55 million US dollars annually for the next 20 years for the bridge, the energy bridge, the gas to shore pipeline in particular. 20 years from today, we're still paying for a pipeline, a gas to shore pipeline. That sounds as if we'd have been way past mid transition, as they're calling it, and we're still paying for this pipeline. That's the sort of concern I have. Secondly, economists worry a little bit about incentives. Will we be removing the incentives we have, the incentives that now exist, because of the serious concerns about achieving, the effort to achieve net zero and the energy transition? Those incentives are being ameliorated somewhat by our access now to our associated gas. Are we taking on board that incentives really bite? They're serious. I've just been reading that under the Inflation Reduction Act, with all the significant incentives that are being offered to companies so that they could begin to do things in a low carbon sort of a way, that even oil companies, led by ExxonMobil, of course, these companies are taking advantage of those incentives provided by the Inflation Reduction Act. They themselves are responding to those incentives. Prior to the Inflation Reduction Act, they were muted. This talk about low carbon technologies. Now there's cash in it. They're talking about it seriously. By the way, I might mention, and Ulrich might know more about this, but I've heard colleagues indicate, well, climate scientists and scientists indicate that carbon capture and storage technology is still incipient. It is not, the basic science has not been sufficiently understood for it to be scaled up. Now, here's the energy thing, the bridge concern that we have. Are we locking ourselves into the old world, if you will?
Yeah. So
When we point the fact
that's a good question.
we need to be thinking actively about the future. We don't have the comforts, the space, if you will, to be actors of the past.
That's I wanted to, so in the question of gas, and so I wanted to go to the regional expert around us, and thinking about, I see even now Trinidad and Tobago engaging in some gas related activity with Venezuela. How do we see this natural gas, at least from your perspective in the regional sense, as a kind of transition to the net zero world? Dr. Brian.
Okay, sorry about that. I was listening intently. I didn't have my microphone on. I don't know. Gas is essential. Obviously, to keep Trinidad and Tobago's infrastructure going. All right, we have in the Point Lisa estate, as all of you know, maybe 120 industries that depend on natural gas. So I think the government is anxious to exploit this to the fullest. And the Dragon arrangement, in which the United States government, at least one of its agencies, has given way to allowing Trinidad and Tobago and Venezuela to exploit the Dragon gas potential. I think that's a good step forward. But it tells me something about regional efforts in this regard. The idea was put forward, I think, by Prime Minister Rowley and the Energy Minister, that somehow or the other, having this arrangement with Venezuela, in which gas is piped from the Dragon field to the south of Trinidad and monetized in the Atlantic LNG facilities. We have 4 LNG trains there. Then this is a step forward in terms of regional gas production. So as David would know very well, one of the things that we have been advocating is a strategy, a Southern Caribbean energy matrix strategy. A strategy taking all the points that Ulrich has made and that Dr. Stilgen has just made of being able to regionally cooperate and to use gas for the region. Terence, as a transition fluid, fuel, it still maintains its provenance in that regard. Okay, we haven't found anything else yet. I mean, there's hydrogen, there's a number of other things, but so far, LNG continues to be the transition fuel for us. That is to renewable energy. Well, that's about all I'll say at the moment, unless there are other issues.
Sir, I was just going to give Dr. Trots a moment to weigh in, if he wanted to weigh in at this moment. Dr. Trots?
Yes.
Yes, you can go ahead. You're muted once more. Yeah, you can go ahead. You just unmute yourself.
Right. Yeah. Oh.
You got it. We can hear you now.
Yeah. A couple of things on natural gas. It is regarded now and globally acceptable as the best bridging fuel as we transition. The reason is its availability for one, and its lower carbon intensity compared to diesel and what we are using at this point in time. One might, there's been, I don't know if we realize that the time span between exploration and production in Guyana is record. Mm-hmm. It has been accelerated. One word, of course, of caution is that I would hope that in the haste, I'm not criticizing the pace at which it's done, but one would hope that in the haste, no sort of corners are cut, and that basically the greatest care is taken to ensure that we can manage the likely environmental issues that arise as a result. Having said that, the reason why it's important and what informs that pace is that I think there's a realization that there's a limited time for which fossil fuels will be in the market. So the whole idea is to get in the market as quickly as possible. And coincidentally, in 2015 was when the world realized that they had a shortage of supplies. so that the prices have spiked. And then up comes the Ukraine war, which basically further exacerbates that situation. So the whole idea basically is to get as much as possible into the market when the prices are good, so that you could reap the benefits. There is one issue here, though, that we need to consider as we are looking at the gas. I don't know if I mentioned it, if you'd heard it earlier, but as a result of this energy shortage, UK, first under the last conservative government before this one, their response was to lift the ban on fracking. They changed government, and the response was, same conservative government, was to provide a permit for a new coal mine. Germany's response has been opening up closed coal mines. India's response has been investing I think it's about 900 million US into a gas pipeline for natural gas distribution during the transition. So the energy security issue is what has been pushing that. And there has been some discussion of something called, just like with nuclear energy, a non-proliferation agreement, which basically would decide on who distributes how much among the fossil fuel producers. And of course, and I think I heard Vice President Jagdeo referring to this during the energy conference, that new producers are concerned that they might be muscled out of the race. But Guyana, having what we call sweet oil with low energy intensity, and which basically produces at a very competitive rate, feels that with that type of resource, they have a place at the table if, in fact, in an international negotiation, if it does take place, it is done fairly and not, as we know, is done. So there is a reason, I guess, for this focus.
As you know, I could have this conversation all day. I just looked up at the clock and realized it all slipped away from me. It's already 11:54, and I feel like we've just really started the real conversation. So we're coming on the end, and so I wanted to offer everyone a chance to weigh in, but I wanted to somehow get something concrete around this Guyana, the carbon balance sheet, the region's carbon balance sheet, the questions of resilience, and, as you've just rightly noted, the questions of adaptation. And so maybe if each of you can take 2 minutes to go through this, to kind of somehow capture the carbon balance sheet, if you want to think about the forests and the petrochemicals, resilience and adaptability, and Guyana, and more broadly, the region. So, Dr. Bryan, I'll go to you first, then Dr. Singh, then Dr. Trots, and then David, you get to close us out.
Thank you, Terence. It's the historian in me, actually. I like to look at the larger picture, and in a sense, what have we learned from Dr. Trots' paper and the discussion? Well, I think the first thing we have learned is that Guyana's forests have created environmental space for the simultaneous development of its oil resources and its net carbon sink credentials. This is a rarity among countries, but Guyana certainly has done that. The second thing that I think it's a concern rather than something we've learned is that the royalty rate for the Exxon-led consortium extracting gas from the Stabroek Block is among the lowest in Latin America. All right. Now, there's been some attempt to change that. I think the vice president announced that the government intends to reclaim 20% of the existing Stabroek oil block from Exxon in a bid to inject more competition. But I make that point because it goes to something that Dr. Singh said, that really, what is this? Minimal payment for something for the greatest resource in the world, it's something that has to be corrected. And that also leads, obviously, to the fact that, as I think the paper tells us, is that transparency around oil revenues, government spending, and the wealth fund is critical to avoid any possible negative turn for the economy. One of the other things I think, and I said it earlier, is that Guyana has the capacity and the credentials to influence the global agenda with respect to renewable energy and climate change. The country is impacted severely by climate change. And so, growth and development trajectories are going to be the key drivers for Guyana and for the global world, to have the target that we are talking about by 2050. Another thing that I think I gathered, although it wasn't expressed fully, is that adequate international support is essential. And I see this based on the principle of historic responsibility. I know this sounds kind of trite, all right? But really, I think developed nations do have a responsibility to react, to make institutional capacity and financing urgent for regions like ours. What this transformation of energy systems, which Dr. Trots outlined so well, is it provides a historic opportunity to deliver on both climate mitigation and development goals. This is an excellent opportunity. Making progress at the pace necessary to deliver on global climate and development goals is going to require investment. And that's where I come back to the point that, maybe Guyana is in a position to do a lot of this. I think developing countries, probably those of us need to engage effectively in setting the global climate action agenda. And I go back to the point, that Guyana is probably well placed to do this. And in the region, we need to have consensus. And one way to build consensus and bind commitments, which is a point that all of you have stressed, is through the development of long-term strategies and their articulation in the NDCs that all of us has presented to the international community. It's time to come up to the plate and start to deliver. These are really, I think, the points that I gathered, amongst others. And I think that's the larger picture as I see it. I hope that answers some of the questions.
Certainly does. Dr. Singh, do you want to,
Well, that was excellent, Professor Brian, and I certainly thank you for having, so clearly mapped it out for us. You were speaking on behalf of all of us, I'm sure. And it's not very much I can add, but this is what I'd like to add. That we need in Guyana and probably in the Caribbean to learn to use incentives. We need to learn incidentally on the whole, but when it comes to incentives, we sort of don't understand the power of well designed incentives. For example, natural gas, associated gas, as a transition, um, so fuel. What if we decided to shorten the horizon for the extraction of this associated gas and put a limit so that it just doesn't simply run with the oil, if you will? I mean, technically it has to, but if we developed a strategy, you referred to Professor Brian referred to it as a long-term strategy. If we did that sort of planning, that sort of um, dynamic optimization, that's what it really is. And we chose our instruments very carefully, the way people do in the United States. I mean, there was such a major debate on whether the IRA was going to be effective because it provided subsidies as against implementing taxes. We don't know how to use incentives very well. And when I suggested the upstream carbon tax, I was precisely talking about the use of incentives. That is about all that I would like to add. To say that we must learn in general, we must certainly learn from the mistakes made by others. And secondly, we must in particular learn about the way incentives work because we're now dealing with actors who care about incentives, care immensely about incentives.
Dr. Trots, what are some so close with the thought about incentives uh, in terms of this carbon balance sheet and promoting resilience and adaptability in the Guyanese context.
Well, I have to think about that one a bit. uh, uh, I let me deal with something that Dr. Bryan brought up. He used a term that we haven't been talking about this morning: pace. The pace at which uh, transformation takes place, and there is a time factor to all of this. This transformation needs to take place as quickly as possible. And the other thing that he said that caught my attention, and he's quite correct, that the quicker we transform that energy sector, which we're in the Caribbean are regarded as one of the most energy intensive regions in the world, which makes us uncompetitive in everything we do, or manufacturing or tourism industries, etc. But what that does, transforming the energy sector, it provides all of our governments with some fiscal space. And with that fiscal space, they have resources to start to pursue this climate resilient development pathway, which includes adaptation. And in essence, I feel that now that we have access to resources, the opportunity is there for accelerating Guyana's successful pursuit of a zero carbon climate resilient development pathway in keeping with the global requirements under the Paris Agreement, and extending the scope of operations to address regional energy and food security and the region's transition to a low carbon resilient pathway. I'm confident will redound to the overall benefit of CARICOM and the sustainability of its future. And one final word, I know my colleague Thomas Doxing, one of the issues, several of issues he has with carbon credits. But one thing I would suggest, we have made strides in that direction. But one thing I would suggest that would strengthen our hands to move towards a carbon credit for forest conservation activity, much more, well, I'd say acceptable, is the possibility now that the government in Brazil has changed for an alliance with Brazil, President Lula, bringing together the conservation not only in the Amazon basin, but in the Guyana Shield, which is a unique forestry estate, and to look at how together we can fashion a global regime that provides compensation that is meaningful. So I would like to end on that. Incentives, one of our problems in the private sector and whatnot is that we don't have incentives. We don't have a culture of incentivizing in the Caribbean. There's no support, venture capital, and these types of things. Plus, the other thing, don't forget that I think personally, no offense meant, that our private sector in the Caribbean, and it's something I try to point out when we speak to developed countries, don't think that the culture of your private sector is like ours. They have support systems, but apart from everything else, our private sector is risk averse, and there are no checks and balances or support systems that help them to basically take risk. So that's an environment we would have to deal with. Thank you.
Thank you.
Terence,
Go ahead, Professor Brian.
yeah, one word. I think, the biggest takeaway from what Ulrich has done, he has shown that climate action is not separate from development action. Okay, it has to be fully integrated with, anchored in development efforts, simply to avoid development setbacks, to promote new opportunities for growth and well-being. That is the biggest takeaway, I think. I mean, all of the other arguments are there, all of the nitty-gritty is there. But as I say, sometimes I look at the forest, not at the trees. And that is what I grasp from this. And I think it's a point that must be emphasized. Thank you.
Professor Brian. And so on that, I suppose, I listened to Professor Trots and I thought he sounded quite optimistic, except at the point of incentives. So David, you get the last word to say thank you and maintain the optimism or to kind of move in the direction of the not so optimistic possibilities on incentives.
Well, thank you all. I'm glad we got over our technology hiccups. And certainly, as I've mentioned in all our episodes to date, this is work in progress, what Guyana is going through. We've seen not just in the oil and gas sector how people have commented that this is unprecedented in world history, what the political system, what the economy of Guyana is adjusting to. And I think that, that's something we need to bear in mind, not only in the oil and gas sector, but grosso modo, the entire economy, the entire society, and everything having to do with what we've discussed today is work in progress, with the caveat, as all have mentioned, that urgency is now. The timeline is now, as soon as possible, and we need to look for ways to leverage all these resources which now are available. As Professor Trots mentioned at the beginning of his paper, the excuse can no longer be there is no money. That is now the challenge. We've pinned the tail on the donkey. There is money at the government level, at the private sector level. The challenge now is, can we use those resources adequately, properly, and in a timely manner to build up this resilience which is needed? So with that, let me thank you all for joining us. For our listeners in the virtual world, the paper will be posted on our websites. You'll be able to download it and look at it. And we wish you all a happy Easter recess, and that you join us for episode 11, which will be after Easter on Wednesday, April 12th at 10:30 in the morning Eastern Time as usual, and you will be receiving notifications electronically as to the topic, the speakers, and to the participants. So Professor Trots, thank you for this excellent white paper. Professor Bryan, Professor Singh, and thank you all for allowing the Guyana Business Journal and the Caribbean Policy Consortium to be with you today again on this topic.
My pleasure. Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
Bye-bye.
Wonderful afternoon,
Bye-bye,
colleagues.
everybody.
Bye-bye.